So, Saed, if we can go back to the early days, tell us, who was the young Saed, and how did the values or experiences from your youth kind of bring you to the person that you are today?
Well, first of all, thanks, Peter, for inviting me, and thank you all guys for coming. I hope you'll get your money's worth tonight. That's right. I actually tried to kind of convince Peter, maybe there are better people to actually invite, because I'm usually found in Zaman most of the time, as a lot of you know, as definitely Omar knows. And probably accessible to a lot of the folks here. But then eventually he convinced me by cutting me in at 25% of the ticket sales, right? Is that it?
We agreed on 5.
Oh, okay, fine. He drives a hard bargain.
With a pizza for your son.
All right, sounds good. Sounds like a plan. Anyway, so back to your question. So I guess when I kind of go back and reflect at some of the things that influenced me in while growing up, it's one of those things that you can't really realize or understand while growing up, and you start kind of thinking about them and understanding them as you advance in life and mature. So sort of looking back and learning some of those lessons takes you a while, right? And for me, I think maybe 3 things stand out from the early days. First of all, I think my father, Allah yarhamu, he was a great role model for me. One of the earliest things that I've learned from my father is how to actually teach values by doing them as opposed to by just talking about them. And one of the most important values that I've learned from him is character and honesty and straightforwardness. And although he used to joke a lot, I remember him making jokes like, hey, if you ever want to steal something, make sure you steal something big, right? Because it's not worthwhile if it's something small and you take the risk, right? It's not worthwhile. But he was one of the people who was so straight in everything that he did that it ended up actually on the long run sometimes working to his disadvantage, right? Or one proverb that he had always used to use is, for you guys who speak Arabic, which is most of you, كان يقول القارب المكسور قرصه بجرة. Okay, so don't waste your time on something that, or on fixing something that is broken. But his actions were very different than that. He always went after trying to fix everything that he found broken, whether it is in his sons or daughter, right? Or in the people that are closest to him.
So what do you find in you?
Oh boy, we don't have enough time to go through that. But I'll get back to that point. So that was one thing that I've learned more on the character side, I guess. Another part that kind of influenced me also, something from my father as well. One time he brought me this postcard, and on the postcard was written the following words. People who dream impossible dreams and strive to achieve them raise human stature a fraction of an inch in the process, whether they win or lose. He got me this postcard when I was about maybe 13 years old, and at that time it was very hard for somebody at that age to understand what that really meant, or to kind of fully understand what that really meant. But it was enough to teach me that having a dream is something important. And that came back later in my life to support a lot of the decisions that I've made. And I think the third thing that influenced me in a very big way was what caused me to fall in love with programming, and it's really a love relation in programming. Coding and technology. If that was a woman, it would have been my second wife. All right. I hope my wife doesn't hear that. But anyway, so my brother on my 14th birthday brought me a book, and that book was a programming book teaching the basic programming language using the Sinclair ZX Spectrum or Spectrum ZX. This computer or this PC was released in 1982, and I was learning how to program it in 1983. These names are probably not familiar to anybody in this room. Maybe Sandy heard about it over there. But we're talking about the kind of PC that didn't have a monitor, didn't have a hard drive, okay? Of course, certainly no internet. And in order for you to actually load a program into that computer, you would bring a tape recorder. Anybody knows what a tape recorder is? Okay. And you put a cassette in the tape recorder. You plug it into the PC through a modem, and you press play, and you hear, the sounds of the modem connecting to the PC and loading the program into the PC's memory. This is the earliest kind of experiments that I had with programming. And when I got that book, I didn't have a PC, I didn't have an access to a PC, but I read that book cover to cover so many times, and I was so intrigued and fascinated by it to the level of obsession. And I think, kind of looking back, one of the things that got me so obsessed with that was the fact that, for a 13, 14 years old kid who at the time lived in an environment in occupied East Jerusalem, where I felt at least that most of the things around me were outside of my control, all right? All of a sudden there's this thing that I can actually tell it what to do, and lo and behold, it actually does it, right? There was this one angle in my life that I was able to have some control over, right? I'm not a control freak, don't get me wrong, but this was something that really fascinated me. And that was the start of my love affair with computers and programming.
Right. And that was what age, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, that was 14.
Is that your first kind of experience with as an entrepreneur, kind of learning the steps?
No, I think that was my first experience as a programmer, maybe as a geek, right? That was kind of me coming out, the geek in me kind of coming out of the closet. But my first entrepreneurial experience was when I was 17, right after I finished high school. I went to the Rothberg, the International School or actually the School of International Studies in the Hebrew University. It's called the Rothberg School. And this is a school basically in the Hebrew University where people who come from outside of the country who want to enter into the Hebrew University but have zero knowledge of, for instance, the Hebrew language, spend 1 year, preparatory year in that school, right? So I was there because I didn't learn Hebrew in high school. So I was there learning that and also studying some material that would get me to kind of the first year in the university, and starting to learn more about, I would say, the quote-unquote the Israeli society. I didn't know much about it. And I realized that the Orthodox population, right, have a lot of limitations or restrictions around women meeting men and men meeting women, right? And I noticed in some of the Hebrew newspapers, some some pieces in the classified sections of people advertising that they want to get married, right? So my first entrepreneurial experience was a matchmaker. So what I did...
For the Orthodox?
Yes, for the Orthodox Jewish community, right? So what I did was, I went, I published an ad basically saying for people on both sides, the women and the men, to send me. We're talking about no email, no web form applications. Send letters with a certain fee, right? With what they're looking for in a potential husband or wife, right? And I used a PO box in East Jerusalem. Now, at the time, here's where the story kind of gets interesting. At the time, my father didn't have a PO box. So what he used to do is share the PO box of my uncle, right? He was waitlisted, basically waiting for his PO box in East Jerusalem. So I did this ad, and one day my uncle used to come and bring the letters to my father, right? And so one day my uncle comes, right, with a letter that basically has in its addressed to the matchmaking services of whatever, right? And he gives it to my father, and he says, "What is this?" Right? This is not the problem. The problem is that my uncle at the time was it got shut down very quickly, and I had to publish an apology in the newspaper saying, this was all an unfortunate misunderstanding. So that was the first.
Nice. Did you make any matches before you were shut down?
I made one. I don't know if it actually happened, but I made one, and I made some money. Lasted me for a couple of weeks. So there you go.
So after high school, you kind of left Jerusalem and headed for the States. Is that correct?
Not right after. 1 year after.
Well, can you tell us kind of what motivated you to leave Palestine and head to the States and kind of your initial experiences there?
Sure. So thinking back, I think me leaving was not, what somebody today might kind of think about in terms of, is having a solid plan or going abroad to pursue your education or what have you. Any of these kind of rational models that would make sense. Honestly, leaving Jerusalem was simply an escape. That's as simple as that. Growing up, I felt that I was living in an environment that didn't allow me to dream, literally. And I felt that my surroundings, okay, didn't get me to a point where I would feel that, if I exerted myself, then anything is possible. And I think there was one point. I mean, it's obviously, we're talking about 88 is when I actually left. So you can imagine that, that was the time when the first Intifada was taking place, right? So, talking about 87, 88. So I'm a graduate of that process, sort of. But one of the things to kind of understand is that, you're living in an environment where you have to deal, and I'm sure people here understand that very well, because it's not something that is in the past. It's something that we still live as Palestinian people today in many parts in Palestine. But you're living in an environment where you have to deal with realities of occupation on a daily basis, and then your efforts, right, your energy is mostly spent on that as opposed to be spent on other things that can actually drive you forward. And I felt that there wasn't many options. One day I used to work in a place in West Jerusalem. I used to work as a cashier at a hotel. It was one of the jobs that I did at that time. And if any of you is familiar with Beit Hanina, which is where my family used to live back then, this was before they kind of did all of the bypass roads, right? The bus service used to run through the neighborhoods of Beit Hanina, right? There was bus number 25 that would usually run through that neighborhood. And I used to take that bus back and forth to work, right? And one day I was coming back, right? And going through Beit Hanina, and usually these things weren't rare occurrences, right? But, the bus was passing through the neighborhood, and it got hit by several stones, and then it got hit by a Molotov cocktail. And this is while I was in the bus, right? And it was a very strange feeling at that point when that happened. It's not like I'm not used to this, because you used to see these occurrences happening very frequently. So it's not like you didn't expect it, right? You did expect it, right? But to be on that side of the equation was a little bit unsettling. On one end, obviously, you can't help but fear for your own safety. Not so much from the Molotov cocktail or from the stones, but from the risk of being identified as a Palestinian.
Yeah.
Because then you're going to really get it, right? On one end. But on the other end, you couldn't think, even internally, right, that this shouldn't be happening. Because you also understood why that was happening. So this was, for me, a really strange situation to be in, right? On one end, you're in a situation where you feel, right, a daily risk in the life that you're living, but on another situation, you understand why that is justified.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I basically at one point woke up one day and basically said, "This is it. I'm out of here," right? And getting out of there wasn't easy either, right? But I managed to do that.
Oh, that's great. And today, when I speak to a lot of the youth, I kind of get that same thing they just said. They don't see their dreams happening here, or they kind of see no future or opportunities. Do you think that from '88 to today, that's a huge difference, or it's very similar? Like they need to leave Palestine in order to make their dreams come true?
I think being in the situation, it's very easy to believe that that you really do need to leave Palestine for that to become true, for you to be able to dream big. Today, I don't believe that this is the case.
Why is that?
I do believe, however, that leaving the country, right, if that is for the reason of getting exposure, okay, for building experience, for learning, that would be a positive, assuming you're able to actually commit to bringing that experience back. And that is a very, very hard challenge to do, to leave the country and establish any level of permanent presence somewhere else and succeed in that. And then make the decision to come back is a very, very difficult decision. And, the older you get and the more established you get, the more difficult that decision and the greater the sacrifice becomes. But back to your point, why don't I believe that that is the case? I don't believe that that is the case is because I did go to the States, and there were a lot of positives, obviously, in me going to the States. And, if I was to ask today the question, would I be where I am today if I didn't have that same experience? Honestly, I couldn't answer that question, but I can point to specific things that happened along the way that led to where I am today that probably wouldn't have happened the same way. But I did ultimately discover that the things that I thought were limiting me back when I was growing up in East Jerusalem were things that mostly fears that I actually imagined. If you really think about fear, for the most part, it's about something, or it's regarding something that is going to happen in the future, right? You're about to do something, and you fear a certain consequence that may happen, but it's something that happens in the future. It's never a current, not never, but in most cases, it's not a current and immediate reality. So that really means that if you take that logic to the next conclusion, it means fear will depend on how you choose to think about future. When we think about future, there are so many scenarios that you can think in your head, right? And it's basically what scenario do you choose to believe in? And fear is a factor of that scenario. And that realization, right, was key for me, because I think that had I stayed here and was able to kind of arrive at that realization, then the limitations that I imagined, okay, I think I could have overcome.
Would you be able to list maybe a few opportunities that people here might have that they just don't see, that kind of are blind to?
You mean in terms of opportunities in what?
Just in general, kind of, I mean, for example, you kind of say this sometimes, there's more money here than there are entrepreneurs, in a sense. That's not quoting you quote word by word, but
right,
kind of things like that.
So I think, look, I think when you talk about entrepreneurs in general, right, one of the qualities of entrepreneurs is their ability to identify problems. And I do talk about the ability to identify problems before talking about the ability to solve problems, right? Because you're not going to be able to find solutions to problems that you cannot identify, right? Yeah. So for you to be able to kind of have that ability in terms of identifying problems, that is something that is completely agnostic to the geography in which you exist, right? The question is, are you able to identify problems, or in other words, opportunities, because, you know, I think problems are ultimately opportunities. So are you able to identify problems that are big enough, that are large enough, okay, in the specific geography that you are in? And that is a controversial question being in Palestine, because then it really depends on the industry that you're in. If you're in the tech industry, then I believe that the answer is yes, because there is really no reason why you should limit yourself to opportunities or problems that exist only in Palestine. However, other industries may not lend themselves to the same kind of dynamics that exist in the IT industry. So the short answer to your question, yes, I think you can do that here.
So now that we're talking about startups and kind of starting up a startup, tell us a little bit about Sadara and kind of when should a startup be approaching Sadara? And what are you looking for exactly on the team, on the startup, the idea, the business?
I'd like to kind of look at in terms of startups are it's companies or teams basically that have reached a point where they've identified a significant market, have figured out kind of how to reach it, and actually have the beginnings of a solution that solves a very fundamental and very big challenge in that market. That's kind of the overall, you know, approach that we look at. What we have done so far is try to stick to that, but in you know, in a very big way, or actually, I'm not going to say in a very big way. Actually, in a few occurrences, we actually veered from that criteria, and that happened for several reasons. First of all, I think part of what makes a startup attractive for investment is the team that is launching this startup. All right? And that's not a small part. That's a very significant part. It is a very significant part. Even if all the other boxes check out in the sense of market opportunity, go-to-market, solution, but the team is not the right team to execute on that opportunity, then that opportunity or that business opportunity for us as investors becomes uninvestable. The opposite is not true. The opposite is not true. If we're able to actually find teams, right, that are solid, but the idea is not necessarily where it needs to be in terms of maturity, okay? Sometimes we are willing to make that risk, or to take that risk. So we've had two occurrences, or two examples. One that has already been an investment, we've already made that investment, and the other one is about to close, where the startups are not as mature as we would like them to be, right? But we have a very good feeling about the teams. And so we purely invested based on our belief in the team. A very good example of that is Pinch Point, okay? I mean, Khalid Abu Khair, is Khalid Abu Khair here?
No, he's dancing.
He's working hard.
Okay, see, that's why we like him. Khattar, fun? No. Everybody's working. Okay, that's good. See, that's my point. Great team. So these guys came to us and basically said, "Hey, we want to start a startup that builds games, and we have this great idea about a game called Spermania, right?" So and that was pretty much it. I mean, yeah, okay. So there were more details, but that was pretty much it.
What's like about their team? What was unique about them, like themselves?
Come on, I mean, you know, if you know Abu Khalid Abu Khair, you will know. Yeah, he's really tall and really loud, so, and sometimes obnoxious, so there you go. So that's, look, I think if you talk about entrepreneurs, I think there are certain qualities of an entrepreneur that that are part of the DNA. It's not something that you can acquire, literally. Like if you don't have it, no matter how many programs you go to, no matter how many seminars you attend, no matter how many talking heads like me you listen to, it's just not there.
So you're a born entrepreneur?
I think so. Now I do believe that these, that gene, if there is an entrepreneurial gene, right, can be either raw or it can be developed. It depends on the experience that you've gone through. But beyond that, right, I don't think that you can go from not having it to having it. And I think if I want to point my finger, I put my finger on some of the, I guess, qualities that you would see in some of these entrepreneurs. Well, first of all, they're natural leaders. That's one of the first things that you would see in an entrepreneur. And by the way, I would distinguish that between that and between founders. There is a fine line between founders and entrepreneurs, right? I think most entrepreneurs are founders, but not every founder is necessarily an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are natural leaders, right? They're tenacious. They have grit. Okay. They have passion about what they're doing. They're risk takers. They're great at identifying patterns. They're great at identifying problems. They're great at coming up with one solution after the other, right? Without tiring or without kind of being exhausted. They're great at making decisions very, very quickly. They're great at, executing before planning and planning before thinking. It's more about doing, right? than about theorizing. And the list goes on. There are a lot of things that I think go into the personality of an entrepreneur. There is a great article actually that Mark Suster has on his website that talks about the qualification of an entrepreneur. I encourage people to read it. But you see that, and I think you develop a kind of a gut feeling about people who have the potential, either already there or have the potential to be there, or simply not.
Do you see the gene, the entrepreneurial gene, is kind of a lot in Palestine, or is it you don't see it very often?
I think for anybody who lives in Palestine and is able to make something of themselves and succeed in any way, okay? And I'm not talking about, building the next Facebook or Google or whatever. No, I'm talking about even in the traditional businesses. I'm talking about, getting to a point where you reach success, at least in the way that you define it, all right? I think you have to have some kind of an entrepreneurial quality. And it really kind of surprises me, by the way, because there seems to be a disconnect here between that reality and between some of the things that I run into in terms of the hesitation of some people who have, for instance, jobs and hesitate, for instance, to join startups or maybe launch startups themselves because of the potential risk or because there is lack of security. It really baffles me because when I hear people talk about risk and about security, the first thought that comes to mind, hello, you guys are living in Palestine. Come on. I mean, if there is anything to define risk and lack of security, it's you being here and managing to establish an existence on this land. I mean, there is no better definition than that. And if you're able to survive through that, and then you go and find a job in X big company or Y big company, and your simple main reason of not leaving that is because, well, I'm not sure about taking this risk. Something doesn't connect here for me. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, you did. And speaking of entrepreneurs, there's Saed right there. Saed, show up.
There you go. See?
Talking about you.
Really tall.
There you go. Really tall. Usually very loud.
I wasn't moving that high.
Yeah. What's your entrepreneurial quality?
Me?
Yeah.
I don't know, ask him.
We were just talking behind your back. I told him everything that I know about you.
Okay, that's not good.
Yeah, they were all very, very quiet.
Okay.
They were lost for words.
So those last things you were talking about, kind of leaving your job, I see those as more of a cultural thing. People here are limited, if you don't have a job, you're unemployed, it's seen as a negative thing. I mean, in Silicon Valley, being an entrepreneur, being unemployed, it's the cool hip thing. Obviously, that's taken decades to develop. I think Silicon Valley, they say, has taken about 60 to 100 years to kind of get to the point where it is today. Obviously, Palestine's ecosystem is still young. Do you see it as an ecosystem that's growing and going in the right direction?
So 2 points here. Whether the ecosystem is going in the right direction, and then whether leaving your secure job to do something else is primarily a cultural thing. So first of all, on the kind of the cultural aspect, look, I think there's definitely some resistance at some level to somebody who's sitting in a quote unquote, at least in terms of their perception, a secure job, and then making the decision or wanting to make the decision to leave. There are certain things that will make this decision harder or easier, okay? So, I at some point had to make the decision to leave Microsoft. That was not an easy decision, I have to say, right? And I had to consider a lot of factors. At the time, I was actually married and I had kids, and etc., etc. But the factors that I probably were considering then are probably different than the factors that somebody will consider here in Palestine. I think one of the things that, in my opinion, are not conducive, okay, to a culture of entrepreneurship is the Palestinian labor law. I think there are major flaws in the current Palestinian labor law. One of these flaws is the way the whole, severance structure has been designed. So even if you're in a situation where you're working at a company and you really want to leave, tell you what, you really want to leave not because you want to join a startup, but you're really sick of it. If you quit, right, the economics change significantly in terms of your severance package than if you were laid off or if you retire. And that is just a huge disincentive for mobility of employees. You look at situations in, let's say, in the States, and you see on the CV of people who have a lot of experience that, they didn't sit in one company for 10 years before they made a move, okay? Sometimes they sit for 1 year, maybe sometimes 2 years, okay? Sometimes longer, it's true, but it's not uncommon to find very short, engagements and then move to better jobs, better positions, places where they can make a bigger contribution. And this is actually healthy. That is actually more healthy to an economy than being stuck in a place where you don't necessarily like, but the only reason you're staying there is because you believe that you're going to be economically at a disadvantage. So that's one side of the question. The other side of the question is, okay, so you're talking about whether this is going in the right direction, whether the ecosystem is going in the right direction. That's. Do you want the mic?
I think that's our sign that we're running out of time.
Okay. All right. So I'll just address that. I think there are a lot of variables in that. If you're talking about whether a ecosystem is going in the right direction, there are a lot of variables that will influence that. So it's really hard to give you a yes or no answer. And I'm not trying to evade the question here. I really cannot tell you whether it is or not. I can point out certain things that are going in the right direction and other things that are not. If you were to look at some of the key characteristics, or let's just say key components of what makes a healthy ecosystem, based on Bradfeld's Boulder thesis, basically it's 4 components. You talk about community led by entrepreneurs, all right? You talk about long-term view. You're talking about basically inclusiveness in the community. And the 4th, it's having regular events and activities that engage the full entrepreneurial staff. And if you look at that, by the way, I recommend this book for anybody who's interested in ecosystem development. It's very insightful, and in my opinion, it hits the nail right on the head. Because if we are going to build an ecosystem here, this is probably the only way to do it. It's grassroots. So for instance, let's just take one component of those. Community led by entrepreneurs. I think we have entrepreneurs in town, right? There are not many, there are probably a handful. But are they engaged to the level that they should be, I think, in building the community? I don't think so. And I really believe that it is the best entrepreneurs in town that should take the biggest responsibility for building that community, because ultimately, that building that community to a point where it is mature, okay, will help them, if not in this startup, then in future startups, okay? So it is this approach of give before you take, and we cannot I repeat, we cannot build a community unless we ourselves take responsibility for it. And when I say we ourselves, I am not talking about the government. I'm not talking about the NGOs. Hell, I'm not even talking about us investors, right? Because really, I mean, the real rock stars that are building, that should be building the communities, are the entrepreneurs themselves. Those are the rock stars. As Seth Levine, who's one of our advisory board members, says, the entrepreneurs are the rock stars, we are the groupies. We're just sitting here waiting to bask in the grace and fame of these entrepreneurs when they make it. Other than that, they are the guys who are making it happen, not us. You guys are the guys who are making it happen. You are the heroes. This is basically what it is. So it's your responsibility to build this community. Don't wait for anybody to come and do it for you. And unless you take that responsibility, it's not going to happen. So this is one thing that is not going in the right direction, in my opinion.
Well, how do they get involved? What do they do?
Okay, so I think over the past few years there has been a lot of events, right, that have kind of come together and sustained itself one way or the other at some level of regularity in the community. A great example is you guys, obviously. And I think I have to hand it to you because you're one of the very few events in the community that have been self-sufficient, right? It's the community that is supporting this event, and it's been happening, every month. And I think at least the people that came before me added significant value to the audiences that came and listened to them. So I do believe that you guys are a great example. But there are a bunch of other activities that are going on, and I think people who want to actually contribute, the first thing is to come to the people who are already engaged in doing activities. You've got Peter, you've got Omar here, you've got George over there. Who else is here who's engaged in
you got Neda in the
community? Neda in the back. A bunch of other folks that are probably. Riham is probably engaged in a few things. The Start Me Up folks, other than Omar, are probably here. So come and talk to them. Tell them, it's one of two things, I think. It's either you already can see a problem and you want to fix it. And if you know what the problem is and you want to fix it, go ahead. Start something. You can't do it by yourself. Start talking to people. Find somebody that can support you and go for it. So that's one. If you don't know what to do and you think everything is perfect, then come talk to these other guys who will show you problems and give you tasks or give you things to lead. And but the gating factor is not finding what to do. The gating factor is taking the initiative.
So one last question. 20, 30, 50 years from now, how would you like people to remember you as?
That's a tough one. Look, I think we're gonna go philosophical on you here. Look, I think in my mind, I think if I at least look back, I've never, I'm not the guy who kind of have very long-term vision, honestly, to be very honest with you. But because, it's good to have vision, right? But that vision is usually either growing or shrinking based on the realities that you're facing on a day-to-day basis. And as you make progress every day, you're learning something new. If you're not learning, you're really wasting your time, right? And as you learn more, your visibility increases, and then you have more information, and then you apply that information. Anyway, that was it. I think that's it.
Great. All right, so now we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. So who would like to ask any questions? Saed, just ask away.
So one thing I've been thinking about regarding the Palestine investment community, and what I hear is, and I'm kind of curious to get your opinion from a VC point of view, is a lot of people say it's very hard to invest in Palestine, especially from abroad. And I heard something interesting that in Israel's early development, they actually had a hard time getting funds, considering the political instability and the political risk. Now, how has it been for you guys actually convincing people to bring money here and not just bring it, actually engaging it?
Sure. So first of all, I think anytime you go to a market, not just Palestine, by the way, any time you go to a market where there has been no track record, not for for any specific reason, simply there has been no track record, it will be hard to bring investments. Simply put, capital is cowardly, right? That's investors in general. This is maybe too large of a generalization, and I'm sure there are exceptions. But investors like to kind of see things happen before they jump in. In fact, this is the whole reason why the whole venture capital industry started, because before the venture capital industry came to being, regular investors or investment banks wouldn't have deployed capital in anything that had not the word, but some of the letters of innovation in it, right? Because you just simply couldn't tolerate that level of risk, and that model didn't really exist. So from that perspective, yes, it's hard to bring capital to places where the ROI or the return has not been proven. Now, when you talk about Palestine, it becomes even harder, right? Because of all the realities that we know about here. But I have to tell you something. I think the first thing to kind of understand is, contrary to what might be the popular belief, that a lot of people out there with great ideas are chasing money and they can't find it. It's actually completely the other way around. It's completely 180 degrees, okay? There's a lot of money, okay, chasing not ideas, but the right people to execute on these ideas. Even in mature ecosystems, relatively speaking, are a tiny percentage of the overall population. So if you want to talk about scarcity, it's not the money, and it's not the ideas, it's the people. That's where the scarcity is. It's the entrepreneurs, everywhere in the world. And the only advantage that mature entrepreneurial ecosystems have over us is that they've developed the culture, they've developed the supporting infrastructure, and they've concentrated their entrepreneurial capital. So if you look at Silicon Valley, we think Silicon Valley is great, and by all means, yes, it is great, but compared to all of America, it's a drop in the ocean, right? I mean, why is Silicon Valley only in Silicon Valley? I mean, it's in America. Why is not that happening everywhere else in America? At least initially, it didn't happen everywhere else in America. Now it's starting to kind of pop in other places. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, talking about bringing investors here, look, I think it's very hard to go out and convince almost any investor to come here purely for financial reasons, okay? I think anybody who, at least when we started fundraising, who was interested in coming and putting money in Palestine, did that because of a combination of reasons. They did want to make money, but they also wanted to create impact, okay? And I think that was part of the reason why we were able to attract the investors that we've attracted here. Now, today, that stopped being a problem. Actually, we're now on the other side of it, right? Now we have $217 million raised in terms of capital that is waiting to be invested in SMEs in general. Now, I'm not talking only about the tech industry. I'm just talking about SMEs, okay? And I think overall, in total, out of this 217, probably 77 have been deployed in total. And the rest is waiting to be deployed. So today, the problem in Palestine is not shortage of money. And anyone who thinks that that is a problem, it's time for you to wake up and find the real problem.
Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for the speech, first of all. May I please ask for the book title that you said that talked about the ecosystem? Second of all, since he asked about financial matters, and here you gave a point, there's actually no need to attract external investors or external money. I'm not really sure, is there any need to, at this point, get external investors from somewhere? Is it different to have these international investors over a VC like Sadara and other investors who are currently working in the ecosystem? Something else, we by all means know that probably the best entrepreneurs would come from after years of experience. So as a VC, as Sadara, as one of the main pillars, maybe I would say, our organizations that work in the ecosystem, what do you do to attract these people? Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to you so you can ask these questions again because my short-term memory is screwed up, okay? So first of all, in terms of the name of the book, it's Startup Communities Building Entrepreneurial Ecosystems in Your City, if I'm not mistaken. Brad Feld. Just look up for Brad Feld, that's easier, and you'll find the book. In terms of international investors, look, I think we already brought international investors to invest here, not directly, but through Sadara. Sadara is backed by 24 investors, international investors, including Cisco, including the European Investment Bank, including Google through the Google Foundation. The founder of AOL is one of our investors. If you guys know AOL, anybody? It's like ancient. One of the founders, yeah, remember the "You've got mail," right? I don't know if you guys saw that commercial, but anyway, that tells you my age at least. And one of the founders of eBay, or the first president of eBay, is one of our investors. So in short, we have international investors engaged in Palestine, although indirectly, so through Sadara. But to answer your question, do we today need international investors to come on board still to invest in startups? I think if the question, do we need them for money, then the answer is no. But if the question is there anything else for why we would need them, then the answer is definitely yes, there is something else, and yes, we would need them for that. And the something else is, if you actually invest like us in companies, and by the way, this holds true for any early stage VC, okay? If we invest in a VC in a startup in Palestine, and do a Series A or a first round, the first investment in this startup, then what we would like to see in the following financing that happens, what we would like to see is additional investors coming in and joining us in that investment. But not just any additional investor, investors who are well known to invest in this kind of industry or in this kind of space. Okay, you can call these, sometimes these are called strategic investors, or they're really kind of expert, quote unquote, investors. So if I've invested in, for example, Safer, then my ideal scenario would be to raise another round and to have somebody who has deep experience investing in the travel industry to join the join the round, to co-invest with me. Now, since we're in Palestine, and since not only kind of our investment industry is very young, but also we haven't had this history of startups and expert investors and all of that, it's very hard to find these kinds of investors here. Actually, it's very hard to find these kinds of investors in the region because the whole startup industry in the region is new. So, by necessity, you will want to go after international investors to back you in subsequent rounds or in growth rounds. So that's the advantage. What's your third question?
It's about attracting professionals to the entrepreneurship scene.
So look, I think this is two problems or two challenges there. The first challenge is one that I've alluded to earlier, is the risk averseness of some of the professionals, either because they're really risk averse or because they're too comfortable in the place, in the environment that they're working in, either economically or otherwise. So I think that's the challenge. I remember when Derek was here, right?
Yes.
Who's the founder of Startup Grind. He talked about, was it Norway, as being like the place where there is pretty much, the least amount of innovation. I think it was
Norway or Sweden, one of those.
I think it was Norway. And basically he talked specifically about the fact that people are not incentivized to go out and innovate and make startups because they are making so much money, right? And they're living such a good life and they have a ton of benefits in everything that they do, just by the system and the government that exists. So when there is no incentive and there is no motivation and there is perceived risk, then that's a challenge to overcome to bring professionals into the industry. So that's on one side. On the other side, attracting professionals from abroad is also a problem, by and large because of the political realities, but also because, as I talked about before, it's not always a very easy decision for somebody to, uproot themselves from wherever they are and come here. It is a very difficult decision. There are some people here in the room that have gone through that process or through this decision, including myself. Sam is an expat that came back. Peter is an expat that came back. I think Huda lived somewhere. I don't know if she's still here, but okay, she lived in the States and came back. But I think everybody can agree and will tell you that this is not an easy decision, and it's not something that that you will make motivated by either financial return or improvement of the quality of life. You have to have underlying values that are motivating you to do this kind of decision. Hopefully, in the future, it will be that plus quality of life and incentives and economics. But until now, we're not there. And these are hard challenges. I think the short answer on how do we fix that, you guys, the entrepreneurs, need to produce the first exit. When you do that, I think the dynamics will change. And not just any exit, the first substantial exit.
You have a question back here?
Moyed Hamid Ayaba. You mentioned technology. Do you guys at Sadara accept other markets or other kind of entrepreneurs as far as energy, for example, or that's not, you're just concentrating in IT? That's my first question. My second question is, what margins do your investors look for? What's the minimal percentage they'll accept? mean, you mentioned big names, Cisco, AOL, and so forth. So I'm thinking maybe they're looking for high margins of profit. So maybe you'll get
Sorry, when you talk about margins, are you talking about the margins in terms of the profits of the company, or?
profit margins, yes.
Look, I think, well, first of all, if we're investing in startups, let me start with that question. If you're investing in startups, it would be pretty foolish to actually set expectations in terms of margins, because for the venture capital model, at least, right? If you look at Silicon Valley, and if you look at a lot of the a lot of the exits that come out from mature ecosystems, startups exit sometimes before they actually have profits, and they exit at substantial exits. I'll give you a very simple example. I'm not going to talk about Facebook, but the acquisition that Facebook did, which was, anybody? WhatsApp? No, I wasn't referring to what's Instagram, right. So Instagram, they weren't making profit, I guarantee you, right? Actually, you know, they probably haven't even figured out at that time kind of what the revenue model is, right? But they bought them, and they bought them for a substantial exit, okay? So really the question is, when you build a startup, is what is the value that you are building? It's not something that you're actually thinking about in complete isolation or in a vacuum and completely detaching it from profit, right? Because ultimately, on the long term, you have to have some idea of how do you create profit, right? Because otherwise, it doesn't mean anything, right? But the focus in the early stage needs to be about creating value. It needs to be about creating sustainable value. And it is value that not only is sustainable, but it's also large enough and big enough that somebody somewhere will pay for it, right? That's really the key. So investors, when they look at startups, they're not looking at the short-term profitability of a company. They're looking at the future potential of what that company could be. And then they're looking at, okay, well, if this is a business that could be X size business sometime in the future, then what can we sell it for today? And that's what investors looking at startups look at. In terms of focus on IT, it's a very simple answer. Basically, as an investor in venture capital, investor, you know, we invest in very early stage, even when entrepreneurs are very, very well prepared and come to us and, you know, having most of their ducks, you know, lined up in a row. It's all at the end of the day ink on paper. In most cases, they haven't grown. In most cases, they have some customers, but really nothing that really proves that their model is scalable. You know, they have some proof of concept, but not necessarily any proof that they can really build teams. So, as an investor, you're really not able to look purely at financials and say, look, here's my formula, and if your numbers fit my formula, then I'm going to invest in you. And if it doesn't, then I'm not going to invest in you. It doesn't work that way. You really have to have a deep understanding of that entrepreneur, what that entrepreneur is doing, and a deep understanding of the markets that they're trying to address in order for you to be able to make a halfway educated guess about the probability of that startup and that team doing that startup being successful. And by the way, you have to be much better at much less, I guess, good at doing that, and much better at having a gut feeling about people in order for you to be successful in this business. So my answer is I don't invest in anything else other than IT because I don't understand anything else other than IT. That's simply the answer.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Rishna. I just want to talk about Saed. What's your next step? Especially that you said that like you like that you more with moving on and like kind of change job or change, يعني, to go on in your life. So after Sadara, if Saed wanna do something, what's gonna be, or you just will stay توزع مصاري, or you and if you wanna like to do something else rather than this, like if you can imagine, especially that you say like you can be imagine, what you imagine yourself doing rather than this, and are you satisfied from your contributing in the community, which is I can agree that you should be satisfied.
Okay, so first of all, short-term memory. So first of all, on the question of, well, that wasn't part of the question, it was kind of tangential, but على شغلة المصاري. So I think one of the things that, as I mentioned before, anybody kind of initially coming to Palestine, especially if you've kind of been well established in a place like the United States, you don't make that move for money. Anybody who tells you otherwise is either delusional or lying to you, one of the two, right? That is not to say that I made that move completely for altruistic reasons. No, I'm not. I didn't come here to give charity. Actually, I didn't come here to even establish Sadara or even to stay. Honestly, I came here initially, right, because I just wanted to spend a year with my parents because they were growing older, and I realized one day that 19 years have passed and I haven't gotten a chance to spend time with them. And now, you know, my father passed away 2 years after I came back, and I got to spend the last 2 years with him. So if I was gonna talk about something that was meaningful to me in coming back, that was it, or that was kind of at the top of the list. But you know, when I came back, I thought, okay, I'll spend 1 year and then go back to the States, and here I am, still spending 1 year. And you know, kind of, this is part answer to your question. It's not the long-term vision. I came here and I saw an opportunity to do something, and then I just took that opportunity. It wasn't, wallahi, you know, Saed, this visionary guy who had this amazing dream about establishing, you know, the venture capital industry in Palestine, and decided to sacrifice his life in the States and came. No, it's nothing like that, right? It's accidental, really. It's an opportunity that came up. I saw the opportunity and I went for it. What were your other questions? Okay, so look, I think the short answer is no, I'm not. I'm not satisfied. And I think being satisfied, I think it's important to celebrate small wins, right? I was talking with Peter the other day about that. I think it's important to celebrate small wins and to recognize when you've made something that at least you can see as one step in the right direction, okay? But satisfaction is dangerous, because when you feel satisfied, it actually helps you relax. It helps you get a little bit more comfortable, right? And comfort is such a dangerous thing, to me at least. I talk about this when I talk about my decision to leave Microsoft. Back to the point that we were talking about earlier. Part of the reason that I left Microsoft is that I woke up one day realizing that every day I'm going to work there, I'm not feeling that sense of urgency. I'm not feeling that sense of risk. I'm not feeling that I'm putting something on the line. I'm feeling that no matter what I go there and do and screw up, I'm pretty much guaranteeing this job for the next 20 years, right? And this wasn't the way, by the way, when I first joined that company. When I first joined that company, I used to honestly spend no less than 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours a day. I was newly married and my wife would get bored at work, at home, so she would just come and spend time with me in the office. But I wasn't alone. You would go into Microsoft at literally 11, 12 midnight, and you would see the halls buzzing. When I left in 2000, at 5 p.m., there was nobody in the halls, in the hallways, And Microsoft grew up, unfortunately, right? It grew up, unfortunately, and it lost that, that feeling. And so back to your question, yes, being satisfied is dangerous in my opinion. And maybe some people would look and say, hey, this guy had done a lot of things and been successful in this and that and the other thing. But honestly, I want to think that my greatest successes are still ahead of me. And I want to believe that, at least for Sadara, right, we haven't succeeded. Maybe we started, but we haven't succeeded by any stretch of the imagination. The success will come, again, when one of our companies exits. And what I'm going to do after Sadara? Okay, it's pretty much the same answer. I have no clue. First of all, I don't spend my time thinking about that because that day may never come, for whatever reason. Maybe because I stay in Sadara, or maybe I just don't make it that far. I don't know. And that's not being pessimistic, that's being realistic. I try not to spend my energy thinking about things that I cannot control. I try to live for this moment and try to maximize the impact and the influence that I can have on the things that I have leverage over. The future, I have very little leverage over, just simply because it's not here, right? It's not real. This is a little bit philosophical, but whatever, right?
You want to do something, just imagine what kind of work that you would love to be in. CEO, start working as...
Look, I think Look, I think I cannot put a title to it, but it has to be something. I cannot put a title to it, but it has to be something that involves building things. At the end of the day, I think I'm more an entrepreneur than a VC, and if Sadara was, somewhere in Silicon Valley, right, where establishing a venture capital is just like baking another batch of cookies, right? Literally, I probably wouldn't have done it. They probably wouldn't have let me in a venture capital anyway. But I honestly wouldn't have been interested, even if I was offered, which I probably wouldn't have. But the point is that what we're doing here with Sadara is very much as entrepreneurial, in my opinion, as any one of the entrepreneurs and the startups that we are backing. And had it not been the case, and had it not been that this kind of work allows me and requires me, not just allows me, to be very closely involved with our entrepreneurs, I don't think I would have done it. So I think, building things that haven't been built before is what I want to continue to do. And what that ends up being and what role I play in it, I really couldn't tell you. I even can't imagine, because I couldn't imagine that I would have been doing this like just 3 years ago.
In a way, you are building.
5 years ago, sorry.
In a way, you are building. You're helping build the ecosystem here. Right.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see.
Anyways, so I'm pretty sure our audience has plenty more questions for you. What's the best way to get a hold of you or reach you?
Come to Zaman Twitter. No, seriously. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. my email is saed@sadarabc.com. I'm really very much more accessible than you think. You just ask Omar. He knows.
And you'll be around after this for another 30 minutes networking. So if you have any more questions, I'll be around. So that is about it. Thank you, Saed. I appreciate your time. So Startup Grind was co-founded, or at least the Palestine chapter was co-founded by myself and Neda Marar, right back there in the red. Hey. We also have our great team, Gigi and Dimo, also our great support. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So right outside, they do have a feedback form. We want to know what you liked, what you didn't like. We want to know everything. So we keep making this even better. We are doing this on our own. As you can see, there's no sponsors or no donors. It's all us. It's all you. Cool. Thank you.